Hey, welcome back, everybody. We're going to jump into the next set of notes for Module 2. Last time we were focusing more on the different jurisdictions that there are, federal, state, local, that type of stuff. Now we're going to research the duties and responsibilities of forensic science personnel within those jurisdictions. What do they have to do on a day-to-day basis? So let me bring this down and we will jump right into it. So our learning objective is to research the duties and responsibilities of forensic science personnel. And we're going to do that. We're going to look at how they operate with the federal and state and local level law enforcement personnel. Okay. So first, your assignment, which is due this Friday. If you remember, way back in week 2, we had a 500-word essay outlining forensic science discipline that was in your first set of notes. You were told to keep it, and when you got it back, and most of the time you guys are sharing it through Canvas, so you never really lost track of it. But now is where we're going to add to it, right? So we're going to research the responsibilities of specific forensic science personnel. You can use your previous research as a jumping off point, right? So if you were looking at latent print investigators, or if you were looking at toxicology specialists or a forensic anthropologist or something like that, that can be a great jumping off point. Or you can explore something new. If you kind of lost interest in that topic after you researched a little bit and you want to look at a different specialist discipline in forensic science, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So in this case, you're going to focus on the responsibilities of your chosen profession, which is kind of what you wrote about last time. So you're going to include their day-to-day duties and that type of stuff, but you're also going to pay special attention to the educational requirements for the job. So what does it take to become a forensic toxicologist? How much schooling? What type of degree do you need to get? What would your specialization include? You can even include institutions that you might attend or are top notch for that particular field. If it's forensic anthropology, what are the requirements? And if it's latent print investigator, what are the requirements? And so on and so on for whichever field or specialty field that you chose within forensic science. And then you can also include any other responsibilities they may have. How often do they have to testify in court? What kind of reports do they have to write? That type of stuff. So this essay will be a minimum of 1,000 words. Now you already were right around 500 words, so this is kind of doubling it in size, focusing on those educational requirements. Keep a copy of this again because you're going to use it once again later on. Okay? All right. So let's jump into this. What is forensic science? We're going to revisit this. We're going to do a quick review of the definition of forensic science. So if you remember, we define forensic science as the application of scientific principles and technology to the legal process. It essentially involves the characterization and examination of evidence. It draws on and applies the principles and methods of all the traditional sciences in engineering, including physics, chemistry, and biology. If you remember, we had a test question on that, and a lot of you guys did actually pretty well on it. Because it draws on all these traditional sciences, we must include the basic premise that forensic scientists use the scientific method to analyze evidence. That's the big difference, right? So we're going to kind of review the scientific method, but we're going to look at it from the lens of a forensic scientist. So instead of talking about visualizing a problem or seeing a problem and then testing the problem, we're going to talk about seeing the evidence and then testing the evidence, right? So we're going to kind of add the legal end of it, the forensic end of it, to the scientific method. So the information and data collected from the evidence is then used during the legal process at various levels. So let's take a look at the scientific method. So the first thing you're going to do, and if you remember, you usually have in your science classrooms this little flow chart that shows, you observe a problem, calculate a hypothesis, run an experiment, and then analyze the data, and then state your conclusion and all that stuff. So we're going to look at that, and it's basically the same, but when we do this, we're going to look at it considering evidence is what we're testing, right? Evidence is the problem, or Evidence is what we have to apply our hypothesis to. Okay? So we observe a problem or questioned evidence, and then we collect objective data. Once we've done that, then we consider a hypothesis or possible solution to a problem based on the observation. This gives us direction to work a plan, right? So this step requires inductive reasoning, experience, and imagination. If we see the piece of evidence and we now have enough data, we might say, hey, I think we might be able to test this idea. Maybe this particular tool made that mark. I'm just using that as an example. And then you can run a test, right? So you're going to examine and test and analyze that particular hypothesis, right? And it's either to support it or refute it. So if you have, and I'll go back to the tool mark example. If you have a marking that is at a crime scene that shows a forced entry in the door jamb of a building, and then you have a suspect that was in possession of a particular type of tool that may have been used to make that marking, well, then they can take that tool and actually use it in the lab to see if it can make similar markings. And then they can do a side-by-side comparison. So that would be a way of examining that or testing that hypothesis. Then we use deductive reasoning to make determination as to the significance of the evidence, how important is it, and then we have to evaluate and verify all the evidence. This step is especially critical to forensic scientists because someone's liberty can depend on your work. All possible errors must be stated. Consideration must be given to the standardization, the reproducibility, the validity, the reliability, and the accuracy of whatever you did to that particular piece of evidence. Finally, the forensic scientist must come up with a theory or opinion that will be able to stand up to scientific as well as legal scrutiny. All right, so let's go through the roles of the forensic scientist, right? In previous set of notes, we discussed a variety of federal, state, and local agencies and what they do in the criminal justice system. Often they work in conjunction with each other, and in addition, they all have to work alongside crime scene investigators and forensic specialists. So if you look at the picture here, it shows basically the scene shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing. And you can see it looks like mayhem. You got federal, state, and local agencies along with medical, right? EMTs, the fire department, probably ATF is there because there was an explosion, right? The news is going to be there. Forensic scientists, specialists are all going to be on scene together. And they all have to kind of coordinate with each other. And even though this looks like a little bit of mayhem going on, and it probably was very hectic, being right there on the scene, it still has to be kind of coordinated and everybody has to kind of work together. So, field mice and lab rats. This is kind of something, well, I'll have to be honest, I stole this from a Los Angeles area detective, a retired Los Angeles area detective. Okay, so I was at a forensic science conference several years ago, and I can't remember his name for the life of me. I wish I could. I met a retired Los Angeles detective who had a unique way of explaining things. Right? Spent years and years in the field on the streets. He said there's two types of forensic personnel. There are the field mice and the lab rats. The field mice, he explained, are the individuals outside at the scene documenting and collecting the evidence. They're gathering things up. The lab rats are the individuals that stay inside and do the analyzing, right? They analyze evidence that the field mice collect. And this has always stuck with me, and I use it all the time. Even this series of courses is kind of designed around this concept. I was one of the ones that kind of helped formulate the standards that we use in CTE for forensic science. And even then, even when we were at that meeting, I looked at forensic science 1 as being the field mice. That's you guys. That's what the class we're in now. Our focus later in the year is going to be crime scene investigation. What happens at the crime scene? How do we collect the evidence? And then If you move on and you go to Forensic Science 2, that's where we now become the lab rats. Now we focus on the analysis of the evidence. Whatever's collected at the scene is brought back to the lab, and then the lab techs get a hold of it and they do the different tests to see how significant this evidence might be. And then Forensics 3 is the ologist. I call them the ologists. They're kind of specialists, and they do a kind of a combination. Sometimes they're out at a scene, other times they might be in the lab. So odontology, anthropology, psychology, entomology, pathology, and sometimes they're split between the two. And it's actually one of the funner of the three classes because we do these big projects, right? We do these projects on collecting insects off a corpse and then rearing them in the lab. So they're out in the field collecting the insects, but they're also spending time in the lab trying to identify the species and all that stuff. And there's a link down below that kind of shows how CTE Forensic Science is set up. And you can take a look at that at your leisure. All right. So what are some of the responsibilities of forensic science personnel? There's many different areas of expertise in forensic science. And we talked about that before, right? You're doing your second part of the paper focusing on these specialists, right? Job duties are determined by their areas of expertise. Some specialists spend their entire day in the lab. They're the lab rats. While others spend their day visiting crime scenes in search of evidence. That's the field mice. Most specialize in a single area, such as crime scene photography. So if you're a crime scene photographer, that might be all you're doing is showing up at scenes and photographing them. Or maybe they're specialists in analyzing DNA samples, and they spend the entire day in the lab running DNA samples and trying to basically identify them. Because you are doing your own research on some of these specific areas, right, of your chosen area of expertise, we're going to keep this really basic. We're going to look at what all of them are kind of required to do overall, right? So in regards to responsibilities and duties, we're going to kind of look at a general idea of what they're going to do and the things they have to do, like maintaining, custody, having a chain of custody and documenting things and stuff like that. Okay? All right, so let's look at first. First major thing they have to do is they have to identify and gather evidence. Now, most of the time, this is going to fall to the crime scene technician or the crime scene investigator, the CSI experts. So some of these forensic experts, called crime scene investigators or crime scene technicians, focus solely on the collection of evidence at a crime scene. They sometimes take direction from detectives at the scene. However, officers are also relying on their judgment and expertise. Matter of fact, most of the time the officers will yield to the crime scene investigator as far as how to package, collect, or pick up even a small piece of evidence. So CSI have the extensive training in what makes evidence relevant and how to properly remove that evidence from the scene without damaging it or contaminating it or doing anything else that might affect its probative value. Next up is documenting evidence, and this kind of falls on everybody, right? Extensive and precise record keeping is crucial at each stage of the criminal investigation. As evidence is moved from one expert to the next, as the investigation progresses, they must be able to look at the case files and learn everything they need to know to aid them with the investigation. So when CSI collects evidence from a scene, they have to take detailed notes describing the evidence, its appearance, how it was situated, where it was located, and any other important details that might be necessary or important. Sketches are also included. So a lot of times in the documentation process, they'll have sketches showing the location of various articles of evidence. And we're going to do a lot of sketching and note-taking and stuff like that when we start doing our crime scene investigation in this class. We also document through photographs. So there will be a whole section of this unit, or I'm sorry, not this unit, but this class that focuses on documenting through photography, crime scene photography. So we have to keep a visual record. They take photographs of the entire scene. They usually include the victim's body if there is one, weapons, or other evidence that might be present, and they're going to photograph everything. And usually you want to have more than enough photos, right? So they'll take photos from multiple angles, perspectives, so that the investigators, prosecutors, and jurors can envision exactly what was going on at this particular scene. Next, and this is again the responsibility of anybody involved, especially the crime scene tech, right, or the lab tech. So whether you're in the lab or in the field, you have to preserve the evidence. You have to keep safe its integrity, right? So forensic specialists place evidence in sealed packaging, and anyone who works with the evidence must reseal and sign and date this packaging, as well as document what they did, all on the evidence bag, as well as usually in an evidence log. And there's tons of paperwork. You guys are going to get sick of this, but the good news is when we went to a competition a couple of years ago, we were working on trying to speed things up. So I have a lot of forms that are kind of standardized, and that's usually what is used in the field anyway, these standardized forms that you just kind of fill in the information. So we'll talk more about that when we get closer to doing our first crime scene. Continuing with preserving evidence, this documentation is referred to as the chain of custody. It offers a record of everybody who came into contact with this evidence. If the chain of custody is not maintained, defense attorneys could claim the evidence was contaminated or mishandled. Many times this could result in a piece of evidence no longer being admissible. So if you look at just this simple chain of custody, you see that it has a date and a time. If a person that's a good defense attorney looks and notices, hey, this was collected at 8:30 a.m. on this particular date, but it wasn't turned into the crime lab until 6 p.m. on the same date. Where was it for that long period of time? And if there's no justification for that big gap, oh, I stopped and had lunch and I left the evidence in the trunk of my car, well, they can say, well, since it wasn't in your personal field of vision, it's no longer admissible. Okay. Next up is your lab rats. They kind of focus on the testing part. Although you do a little bit of testing in the field, most of the testing is going to happen with the lab technicians. They focus on analyzing the evidence, right? They may never visit a crime scene, but sometimes they might actually go to the crime scene and do a little bit of on-scene investigation if necessary. But most of the time, they spend their entire day inside the laboratory. They may be involved with comparing fingerprints. They might be doing some kind of testing for the presence of bodily fluids on clothing, or examining tool marks or bullets, or any other various tests that they could perform, right? Whether it's a chemical analysis or looking for DNA or whatever. So they almost always specialize in one particular area of testing and analysis. So it's really specialized. So you have a ballistics expert, and they would focus only on bullets, while a DNA expert would only focus on DNA. They probably have very different educational requirements, right? The DNA expert's going to be somebody that's going to be more biologically situated, or kind of leaning in that direction, has a degree in some kind of biology or genetics or something like that. Well, the ballistics might be more of a physics guy, right? And then finally, they have to, and everybody's kind of involved in this, is reporting their findings, whether the forensic specialist completes a test and has to perform basically a report on what he did and what his findings show, or it could be a report on how a particular piece of evidence was collected, right? So everybody kind of has to write these reports. Another specialist can then review and either verifies or disputes the findings. These reports could be presented as evidence by the prosecution or used by detectives to help further their investigation. And there's just a little example report off to the right, kind of what they might be doing, and just the beginning part of the report. They're a lot longer than that. And then they have to, in some cases, report their findings. These reports include a thorough description of the sample, and sometimes you're going to have to get up there and actually explain. You'll have to be an expert witness. So in addition, these specialists could be required to testify in the courtroom to explain their methods and their findings. What is the accuracy of this particular method that you use to test this piece of evidence? And you're going to get cross-examined by defense attorneys, and they're going to try to shoot holes in everything that you did, and they're going to try to find fault. So you got to kind of stand up to that cross-examination as well. Um, just remember when we practice this in the future, where you're testifying and getting cross-examined, don't take it personal. The defense attorney's doing his job, and if you did your job well, there's not a whole lot he's going to be able to say that's going to be able to refute what you did unless you're being unethical in some way. All right, so that kind of takes us through everything that we need for this set of notes. Remember, you have your paper, and that's due on Friday. Um, it should go from 500 words, which is where we started, to about 1,000 words. And remember, the focus this time is going to be on educational requirements and maybe, how do they maintain maybe certain credentials that they have to keep updated. For example, as a teacher, I have to make sure my teaching license stays updated. What kind of things might they have to do? And then maybe go into a little bit of stuff about what they might have to do for expert testimony as well, like we covered at the end of the notes. All right, guys, have a great day.